All right, hey, I'm Melissa Pierce. I'm a computer programmer, a filmmaker, an activist, and your morning speaker. Thanks for showing up. I'm going to tell you a story about Grace Murray Hopper. She was one of the very first computer programmers ever in the world. And to tell you the truth, I didn't really give... They told me not to swear, sorry. I didn't really care much about who Grace Hopper was 2 years ago. Until just recently. But 2 years ago, a luminary in the American startup community, Paul Graham of Y Combinator, said something a little bit stupid. He said, if you want to find a really good programmer, you have to find someone who's been coding since they were a teenage boy. I know, right? So, this, as you would imagine, didn't go down well with the people looking for diversity, and with me either, because I run a not-for-profit in Chicago called Chicago Women Developers. Women who are mid-career, who decide they want to learn to program, come to Chicago Women Developers, and we mentor them and teach them to program and find them jobs, and they are damn good programmers. But as you might have guessed, a lot of them didn't grow up and become teenage boys, but they are really great programmers. So we had a problem with this, and then oh look, I forgot that this thing does a thing, look. How about that? Marion, my co-producer, made that happen. She was really excited about it, so we left it there. She's like, hey, look, slides. So this happened. And then my good friend, Dave Hoover from Chicago, who runs Dev Bootcamp, sent out this tweet just in time. In case you missed it, Grace Hopper joined the Navy when she was 37. Then she became one of the greatest computer scientists of all time. Well, she didn't start programming until she was 37 either, because it just didn't exist. Of course, at the time, I was 37, Grace Hopper was 37, and I was like, holy shit, sorry. I've got to know more about this woman. So I went to find out more about her. Oh, look, it went the wrong way. So I went to find out more about her, and it turns out that there is not one documentary about her. Juxtapose that to Steve Jobs, who has 9 films about him. I think the 10th one just came out. That dude was a product guy. He didn't even code, right? Everything that he built was built on what Grace Hopper had written and the people that came after her. So, of course, as I am wont to do, there was a gap, and I filled it. Dave sent another tweet. He's kind of the catalyst here. He says, I doubt there's an appetite for it, but I think a Grace Hopper movie would be great. Hey, let's do a Kickstarter. I was like, I'm going to write that movie. I'm going to do this thing, because why wouldn't I? But I'm going to include all of the ladies that I know of that made a difference. So we started a Kickstarter, I think it was an Indiegogo, 4 months later. And since then, I've been busily traveling the US, interviewing a bunch of octogenarians before they die. So it really is kind of this race against time before all of these computer pioneers kick the bucket. And after this talk, actually, I'll be traveling to Stockholm, where one of her compatriots graciously retired in a country I've never been to. So I'm pretty excited about that. But it has been kind of incredible to travel all around the US to homes and nursing homes and talk to men and women who built all the stuff we're doing. It's been a really nice experience. So this is the early trailer, and you should watch it if it will play in presenter mode. That's the Mark I computer. That's Grace Hopper.
How did you know so much about computers then?
I didn't.
How did
I was the first one.
Yeah.
So what's thrilling is I get to tell her whole story, not just the highlights, which is what every book or every TV special seems to do. I get to tell more than her reel of greatest accomplishments before she was a known entity. So I want Born with Curiosity to do something that a lot of these films and stories about our heroes don't do, which is to tell the story of someone who's completely relatable, who is not this anomaly genius who no one can hold a candle to, but someone that anyone can relate to. What makes her human in a way that you could relate to, which is why I'm super glad that this is not the film. I'm giving a talk about Grace Hopper, about how she was a badass, genius, pirate, hacker. Badass is not a swear word, right? So I hope you can relate. One of my friends photoshopped this onto Grace's eye, which was really lovely of them. Grace Hopper is known as a pirate in a Navy uniform. When she retired for the third time, she was a rear admiral in the Navy, which is pretty high up. I think she was the oldest, highest ranking woman in the Navy when she retired. It's quite fetching on Grace, that eye patch. And it's good, you know, because she invented the patch. If you remember those reels of paper from the trailer, this is the section of those reels from the 1944 Harvard Mark I, the very first digital computer. There's a lot of argument about this, by the way, about which computer was the first digital, which was the first this, and they're all lovely. But this was the first digital computer. It's the one Grace worked on. Note the physical patches used to correct the punch holes covering them. Grace did this not only when there were mistakes, though. She also did this when she was too lazy to write another program. Right, so we can say she was the first hacker. We can say that she is where the trope of lazy programmer began, right here, with some tape over some stuff. So if you're keeping track, Grace Murray Hopper, pirate, invented the patch, and we'll argue that she was the very first lazy programmer. Grace, though, was culture jamming long before 1944. She refused to take no for an answer. This is a picture of her when she was 16. This is the year she failed to get into Vassar. She failed the entrance exam. I think it was Latin. Don't worry, she got in the next year, and she completely blew them away, of course. She graduated a mathematician, and then went on to Yale, which she had to petition to get into because Yale, of course, at that time, in the 1920s, didn't accept women. So she petitioned to get into Yale. She was one of a handful of women to get into Yale, and she graduated Yale with a PhD in mathematics, one of 3 women to graduate with a mathematics PhD before 1934. So that's kind of hardcore. Let me make sure I'm not leaving anything out with that. Oh, did she come up in her uniform? All right. I'm slower than my slides. Sorry, guys. So Grace was a mathematics professor at Vassar for a long time, 12 years. And then, you know, she kind of culture jammed that too. So she believed in interdisciplinary mathematics. She believed that you could learn math through anything. This was, in the 20s and 30s, a little unconventional. And she ruffled a lot of feathers with the older staff there, but of course the students loved her. And this really greased a lot of wheels. So she was an excellent social engineer in that way. But in 1941, there was the attack on Pearl Harbor. And as you know, in America, that's when we joined the war effort. And everybody who was anybody tried to join the military, men, women, everybody. Grace was no different, but it would take her 3 years to be accepted into the Navy. The first time she tried, the Navy said, you know what, your job as a mathematics professor is too important to national security. I'm sorry, no, you can't go. Imagine that, having a brain so lovely that no one will let you do anything else. She, of course, petitioned because she really, really wanted to join the Navy and be part of something bigger than teaching math at Vassar. This was her ambition. She always wanted something bigger. The second time she petitioned, they told her she was too small. She's 5'2", 7 stones. You're just too small. You're too small of a person, you can't get in. So she went through all of this rigmarole to, get that taken care of. The third time she tries to join, they say, you're too old, because she's 37. You're too old, you should be out to pasture, you can't possibly do anything else. But Grace, she is crafty. She found a way through all of this. I was about to tell you OG was crafty. OG is an original gangster. You know this, OG? All right, original gang. But OG is also Old Grace. Old Grace. She was crafty, so she fought her way into the Navy, and she would become invaluable to them. Like I said, she was recalled to the Navy twice more after this stint, and retired as Rear Admiral. And this is her in December of 1944 at Midshipman School, which she graduated first in her class. That sounds super impressive, but then you remember that everyone else was about 10 years younger than her, and she was already a mathematics PhD. So what she appreciated about this was that she didn't have to think about what to wear. All she had to do was memorize things. I mean, this was the best thing for her. She was like, I was liberated from having to think about pantyhose and fashion and any of that. And she just wore the same thing every day, had the same routine, and freed up her mind to think about bigger things. So this was perfect for Grace. So Grace graduated the top of her class, and she thought she was going to go work with her old PhD advisor in cryptography. This was her plan. She just wanted to figure out secret stuff. But this is not what happened. Grace was sent instead to a classified, like a top secret mission, which turned out to be in the basement of an old crusty building at Harvard. So here's this mathematics PhD who fought her way through the Goblin City, through hardships untold. And she ended up walking to Cruft's laboratory into the basement. Now, I visited Cruft's laboratory not too long ago, and now it's physics, which is phenomenal. If you walk into the basement, there are pipes and lasers and CO2 everywhere. It's a fun time. But I tried to imagine myself, walking down those narrow stairs into the basement. Tried to imagine all of those huge machine sounds that the Mark I must have made, and all the heat that might have come up the stairs from that, and not knowing what was at the bottom of that, because, of course, it wasn't called a computer. It wasn't really called anything. She didn't know what was at the bottom of those stairs. She could have been working in a machine room of a ship for all she knew. So just imagining the fear and excitement of walking into that, and probably thinking something like, you know what, I had a really cush job as a PhD, a math professor, and I'm about to walk into the basement of this really hot place. So she opens the door, and as she describes it, she opens the door and she saw the most beautiful thing she had ever seen in her life. I can relate to this, of course. I'm sure a lot of you can. So she saw the Mark I computer. And here we have next to her Charles Aiken. He designed the machine. And who is this guy? I actually wrote it down so I wouldn't forget. Oh, Ensign Campbell. You know, the thing is, these guys actually placed bets before her first day to see who was going to sit next to the old lady that was coming in. She was 37, just, you know, that's not old. They were not excited about having a woman second in command. But boy, would they come to rely on her in the unconventional ways she got things done. So you can see her there holding on to what is a program they were running through the machine. So one of Grace's very first tasks as second in command was to write the instruction manual on how to use the Mark I computer. When Grace protested that she'd never written an instruction manual and didn't even know the first thing, because this is her first day, about the computer, Charles Aiken, her boss, said, you know what, you're in the Navy now. So if you want to know how the very first computer manual was written, it was just like that. She had to figure it out. She took 2 months figuring it out. Now you'll notice this is a picture of the difference engine. A good thing to note is that this one, there's one at the Science Museum here in London, which I'll go see. I tried to see it yesterday, but my flight was delayed by very many hours. But the Mark I is actually based on this machine. When Aiken designed the Mark I in 1941, he was having a bunch of problems figuring out how to get it to work. He went up into the attic of a building in Harvard where they had a model, not a full-scale model, just a little model of the difference engine, and this is what he based the Mark I on. And then later, IBM's designers took 3 years to figure out how to actually bring this to life. So from its conception in 1940 to 1944 is when it was finally, the Mark I was finally made. But it's good to think about that when you think about legacy, that it came from Babbage. It came from Ada. In fact, when Grace was assigned to write the very first computer manual, Aiken handed her a copy of Ada Lovelace's notes on the difference engine. A lot of people assume or agree that this was actually the very first computer program. I would probably say that Conrad Zuse wrote the very first computer program, which played chess. But still, it was the first idea of computer programming. So when Grace mentions Ada, she affectionately refers to her as the woman who invented the loop, which is kind of sweet, I think. So Grace invented the patch. Bless you. Ada Lovelace invented the loop. And for a little more, STEM lady trivia, Ada's tutor, Mary Somerville, who may or may not have murdered her husband so she could get an education because he was a jerk, invented the term scientist. Though science and computing wouldn't come in much later, I just love that little bit of trivia, and I think Mary Somerville is a pretty badass, and you guys should all get to know her. Legend would have it that Grace invented the term computer bug too, but this is untrue. What she did was popularize the term computer bug in debugging. She loved to talk, and she loved to tell stories, and she always embellished them. So when you hear any speeches that Grace Hopper gave, just remember that she has been embellishing them for a long time. She was quite the performer. But she always tells a story about finding the moth in the Mark I on relay number 70, panel F. You can see this first actual case of a bug being found in a computer. This moth was beaten to death between a relay. Not only was the moth beaten to death, though, you can see it was made example of right here. She taped it to the logbook. The Mark I ran 24 hours a day. Grace's team worked in shifts around the clock. The Mark I is actually called, they affectionately called it Bessie because it did Bessel functions. And it did ballistics for Navy missiles. It also did, they also figured out some lovely, not so lovely, I guess. And Grace never talked about this. This wasn't something that she talked about, but she did help. The Mark I actually figured out some very sticky things about the nuclear bombs we later dropped on Japan. There's no record of Grace saying anything about this, so I don't know how she felt about it. But she did help figure out those problems using the Mark I. But running these machines 24 hours a day, I always think about this. I think about Grace and her team running these machines 24 hours a day through hurricanes and snowstorms. And then I laugh when I see, I'm sorry guys, bro-coders with their energy drinks, thinking that they're really kicking butt staying up for 1 or 2 nights, hacking on some shit. Because, you know, that's Grace. Grace did that for a year. She just stayed up all night. You know, winning the war. So Grace didn't invent the term bug, but she made an example of it, and if you'll permit me a pirate joke, I'd venture to guess that being taped to a logbook for a moth is the equivalent of walking the plank. Bullying moths wasn't Grace's only pirate behavior. She flew a Jolly Roger in her office. This is not a lie. I assume that in the Navy this is probably a terrible thing to do, but Grace didn't care. She knew her worth, and she knew what she could get away with. She was pretty subversive about things like that. She also believed that anything you needed could be liberated from someone else. Thus, every stick of furniture in Grace's office was stolen from someone else's office. She also stole computer time, although nobody she worked with would call it that, dare call it that to her face. She is, in fact, famous for the phrase, "It's easier to ask forgiveness than permission." So if you've ever heard that phrase, that was Grace Hopper. This actually, "It's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission," is about trying new things, new ideas. She was really in that. So not quite about doing bad things, but trying new things and not giving a crap about what anyone else says about them. She also believed that software should be free and every computer program should work no matter the hardware. She would be mortified at the Internet of Things right now. What a shit show. One gentleman she worked with in the 1960s recalled the story to me, Howard Bromberg recalled this story to me, where Grace was making and giving away COBOL for free to anybody who wanted it, which was pretty awesome. And her reasoning was that everyone should know how to program, and if the information was out there free, they would know how to do it. Of course, this gentleman didn't like that because he was trying to make a living selling COBOL. And she reasoned that, you know, he should just sell the service of servicing people who had COBOL who didn't want to take the time to learn the information. So this was long before Bill Gates' memo about who should be paying for Windows. It was long before Steve Brand's exclamation that information wants to be free at the first hacker conference in 1984. So just remember, who did this first? It was Grace. Grace thought information wanted to be free. It's not to say that Grace was super vigilant or serious about these things. She had a clock that ran backwards in her office. She says it was to remind people to think differently, that they could rewire their brains to think about a clock backwards, but really I just think that she liked to fuck with people. She was, sorry for the swears, she was especially rowdy. So in a speech she gave in the Computer History Museum in the 1980s, she recalled a specific practical joke where someone filled the Mark I computer with these fake bedbugs. The whole thing. I think it was a Mark II, actually. And of course, it shut down the machine. Now, this was after the war. They're still using the machine. And the team wanted a break because Charles Aiken still ran it as if America depended on his baby, the Mark I. But it did shut down the entire machine. And because nobody knew who did this, no one really got in trouble. But Charles Aiken did go around the entire campus of Harvard and find every industrial vacuum that he could to get these bedbugs out of the machine. What he effectively did was vacuum so well that he removed all of the dust from the Mark I. And because it ran on relays, there was not enough dust to make the electrical connection between the relays and the machine. So the machine was actually shut down for a week while they waited for more dust to collect. So this particular act of mutiny didn't only give the team a break for a day, it gave them a break for a week, which is fantastic. Good job, Grace. What a score. Grace won't actually tell you that she did this, but I got it out of one of the older gentlemen that I interviewed, that this was indeed Grace, which is great. So Grace wasn't above mutiny, and she wasn't above introducing several bugs at once to bring the man down. And quite possibly, with the whole Jolly Roger flag thing, she might have been the first member of Anonymous. You know, possibly the first person involved in founding Pirate Bay. We don't know. You know, she's crafty. She's crafty. A fun bit of trivia, which I found really telling and interesting about Grace's personality, is that Grace, like Einstein, refused to follow company rules about not smoking in buildings, etc. I don't know if you know this about Einstein, but he made people change the entire rules of their building codes so that he could have a smoking office, because he refused to go outside and smoke. That was for kids. Grace was the same way. So she also had a smoking office in every single building that she worked in. She forced them to change the rules for her because she was not having it. This is how she worked. And if they wanted her, they wanted everything about her. So she did not bend. Her office was a designating smoking office. So, you know, for 10 minutes a day, people got super interested in whatever Grace was doing and came to visit her. I just think that's pretty cool about her. So, but here's where it gets real. Remember how I told you that Grace believed that you shouldn't ask permission to do anything? Well, no one believed her that computers could do more than math, you know. But she decided to build the first compiler anyway, the very first compiler. So after her stint in the Navy, Grace worked as a senior mathematician at UNIVAC. That was like 1949. And in 1952, she'd written the first operational compiler. This is she wrote the Ada-O. This is actually a picture of the Ada-1. It was just a better photograph. Nobody believed her, she said. I had a running compiler, and nobody would touch it. They told me computers could only do arithmetic. You guys all know how that went down, right? It's quite possible that without Grace Hopper, y'all wouldn't be programming in Erlang or anything. I got you. Yeah, I got you. You'd still be programming in machine code, if anything, because Grace also popularized the idea that, you know, computer programming and computers were a thing. So without Grace, we might all be doing something else. I don't know, scooping ice cream or something. In 1954, Hopper was named Remington Rand's first director of automatic programming. Something about automatic programming is every programmer thought they were going to lose their jobs. Automatic programming was going to make them obsolete. That's very funny right now. Her department released some of the first compiler-based programs, including Mathematic and Flowmatic. So a little known fact, Flowmatic was also the name of Grace's first hip-hop album. She's totally ahead of her time. So COBOL was Grace's idea. She did not write COBOL, but she was smart enough to know that if you developed a program for business professionals, they would buy computers. That was kind of her drive for it. She's like, you know, how do we get them to buy this hardware that we're selling? We'll develop this program that is in, you know, natural language. So she didn't develop it. She wasn't even on the committee for COBOL. Oh, I spoiled the surprise. I'm so sorry. She wasn't even on the committee for COBOL. She just thought of it first. She did develop Flowmatic, which COBOL was based on, which the people that made COBOL said they would never be able to make without Flowmatic. That's why Grace is often referred to as the grandmother of COBOL. A lot of people get this confused. They think that she developed it, that she was on the team. This is not true. She paved the way for COBOL to be made. One funny thing about COBOL is that it was actually, this is actually the task of the Short Range Committee. COBOL was supposed to be a stopgap. Like, it was supposed to only exist for about 2 years before they found a better program. And we're like something on 60 years now. They had a short range committee, a middle range committee, and a long range committee. And after COBOL was made, the middle range, the long range committee were just dismissed. They were like, this is the thing. And as you know, still a lot of our infrastructure runs on COBOL, which is, I don't know how you feel about that, but so when people say she developed COBOL, I get a little upset because it's not it's not just because Grace didn't invent COBOL. I'm not upset about that. I mean, people get cool things misattributed to them all the time. It's that Grace invented something more than that. You know, she opened the door to automatic programming and was ahead of Donald Knuth in developing program languages into natural language, which, you know, is pretty revolutionary. So to recap, Grace Murray Hopper, pirate, hacker, pioneer, rumored member of Anonymous, founder of Pirate Bay, bad mofo programmer who started not as a teenage boy, mind you, but as a 37-year-old woman looking to do more in the world that she had already done. This is where I tell you that Grace was an anomaly. You know, she actually could see herself as something more than she was, which was phenomenal for a young woman in the 1910s. She could see things that others could not. She could put herself in that place. So she was an anomaly in that way. But what's so phenomenal to me is most people don't remember Grace for these things. They don't remember her for revolutionizing the way we think about computer programming. Even think about the fact that compilers are kind of where it all started. I mean, COBOL was one of the very first high-level programming languages, and you know, she started that shit. So does anyone know what these are? Nanoseconds, right. These are actually nanoseconds that have been liberated. Grace Hopper liberated from the basement of several buildings. Some of them that people received were actually liberated from the Pentagon. She just stole telephone wire and cut that up. But nanoseconds are about 11.8 inches long. And she used these as mnemonic devices. Is it mnemonic? What is it when it's just visual? Anyway, she used these as examples of how fast electricity could travel in a nanosecond. And she got really famous for these talks that she went around and gave about computer programming, about why it was important. She gave these while she worked at a digital equipment company, so she was still selling computers. I mean, that was really the name of the game. But she would give these speeches to school children. She would give these speeches to admirals in the Navy, just to get them to understand why it took so long for information to travel from the ground to a satellite and back. I thought for a long time that the Navy asked Grace back for the third time when she was already a senior citizen. I thought for a long time that they asked her back just to kind of do this whole computer literacy thing, like she's a really good spokesperson, she's lovely. But you know, they actually asked her back because she had a big brain, and she had good ideas. And they needed someone who could validate compilers. So they needed someone who actually could understand how to validate not the stuff that came out of the compilers, but the actual compiler. So they brought her back on to validate compilers and to design standards for the military's use of COBOL. And who better to do that than the person who invented compilers and started the whole thing? So she was supposed to come back for about 6 months, and they had her indefinite. And until she was too ill to be in the Navy, she stayed in the Navy. So Grace was a pirate to the core. If you don't believe me, here's a picture of her ship. This is the USS Hopper. It was commissioned in 1997. It's the only U.S. warship named after a computer pioneer. It's one of only 2 named after women. It's currently doing a tour in the Middle East, so it is still operational. After this ship was made, so many women soldiers volunteered to be on it that the Navy actually had to install more women's bathrooms. So they spent an extra $50,000 to put more women's rooms on this particular ship because so many women were proud to serve on that particular ship. These bathrooms are I think they are called the golden toilets because they cost so much money to refurbish a warship. That's some interesting trivia. So it's been quite a journey learning about Grace and knowing about her. I think my favorite part of all of this really is interviewing the computer pioneers about how this is going. One woman that I interviewed just a few weeks ago talked about how she ran the computer club in her nursing home. She talked about how all of these old executives from IBM, et cetera, would come to the computer club absolutely terrified to touch a keyboard. Because in their time, when they were running these huge companies, men touching a keyboard was not okay. You had a girl for that. And you think about how things have kind of flipped. And how this lady was just like, she had to teach them that it was okay to touch a keyboard and to learn to program and to kind of, hang out with the rest of the guys. This is a graphic that we had made for our film, which comes out at the end of 2016. It's got a backwards clock. It has Grace as a young, ambitious woman with that, defiance in her eyes, and Grace as a older woman. I think she's 37 in that picture, and of course that mythical moth that was not the first computer bug, just the one that was made example of, because how dare you put a bug in the machine. I don't know what else I can tell you about Pirate Grace Hopper. This is my last slide. And I think it's going to do that thing that Marion had to do. What is it? Yeah. This is my co-producer's contribution to this. So the film is called Born with Curiosity. Comes out in 2016. The Twitter handle for Born with Curiosity is right here, Born W Curiosity. My Twitter handle is Melissa Pierce. If you follow me on Twitter, though, it's just a bunch of kitchen sink poetry stuff. You're not going to learn a lot about Grace Hopper. So probably just follow Born with Curiosity. It is now a good time for questions, I think. Are we doing questions this conference? All right. Thank you for chilling out with me. This morning it's hard. Garrett is going to get a microphone.
So is that questions for Melissa? Just give me a second to come over to you so we can get them mic'd. Questions? Okay, Bill. Thanks.
So you didn't comment on one of the stories I've always heard, which is that all the early computer programmers were women, and it was because nobody had figured out that this was interesting yet. And after they decided, this is actually important, then they took it away from the women and wouldn't let women program anymore. But all the early ones were women. But you didn't touch on that.
No, I didn't touch on that because it was about Grace. But it is true, most all of the early computer programmers were women. It's not that men didn't find it important, it's that at the time it was wartime and there were no men to do it. Also, computer programming was thought of as secretarial. I mean, it was just adding machines. Grace Hopper's father was in insurance. So he probably had one of those fancy adding machines that was based on the Jacquard loom. Just so you guys know, the Jacquard loom started the French Revolution. You should know this. It's the same thing that all of your smartphones are kind of based on the idea of the Jacquard loom anyway. It's kind of interesting to think about the fact that. But another computer, the ENIAC, was run by all women. You know that the ones here were programmed all by women. And you are right. At some point in the early 60s, when automatic programming became a thing, and all of these programmers realized they would lose their job because now the computers were doing it themselves, they started to do something called the professionalization of computer programming. So they made it a lot more important of a job and tried to professionalize it, make it more like lawyering. And when you do this, and this happened with mathematics as well, and engineering has always been that way. In fact, I don't think the first woman got a degree in engineering until 1952. Grace wanted to be an engineer, and couldn't because it was just unheard of. It was too far-fetched. She thought of literate programming, but she couldn't think of herself as an engineer. That's interesting to think about. But the professionalization also, like any of the things that the women did, became, feminized and unimportant. And really, when you see the big switch happen in men and women programming, because still up until the mid-1970s, computer programming was the most money a woman could make, at least in the United States. When the personal computer came about and it became much less expensive to have a computer, you'll notice a switch even in advertising, where now they have a lot of young men in the advertising as opposed to women, because now they can say, you can now afford a much more expensive programmer because we have these smaller computers that cost less. And then you start seeing the coming out of the nerd culture and the entire culture of that. So it wasn't that nobody wanted to do it. It was that all the men were gone. And then, when they came back, they didn't know how to do it. The women knew how. And then it had already become effeminate, feminized because only the women were doing it. So why would they want to? It was just secretaries. In fact, you could go to secretary school and learn how to program computers. It wasn't considered a science in any way. In fact, we could go into this, because most of my talks are about the history of the culture of engineering and not just about Grace. But nobody actually wanted computer programming. The mathematics department didn't want it. Engineering sure as shit didn't want it. Engineers didn't let computer programmers actually touch the computers, just the keyboards. And it was really a struggle to professionalize computing. Is that good? All right. Anything else? Yeah?
Just 1 second.
So do you think that this nerd culture from the hobbyist computer clubs of the early 80s, late 70s, then led to some sort of self-selection in who starts out to program or study this new area that then was available at the universities, and as such, the women did not enter because they did not identify with this subculture?
Some of that, yes. Also, a lot of women were in mathematics. Mathematics department did not want computer programming. In most colleges, it turned out to go into engineering, which already had a very low enrollment of women because it had already been self-selected. So something else that happened with personal computers is, there's a book just came out about it. I haven't read it. I mean, there are a ton of books about this. There's The Computer Boys Take Over, and there's just a ton of them. But there's one that just came out about gaming, about early games, and how because computers did not have enough memory, you could only do games like, shooting games and things like that, things that didn't really appeal to girls until like the Apple came out and you had Oregon Trail or whatever. But there's a whole thing about how just the programs available were not appealing to girls, and then that was enforced through cultural stereotypes. There are boy games on this computer, so it's yours. So my first computer program, for instance, was BASIC. We were just talking about this last night, where my dad had a Tandy, and I programmed a bunch of stuff in BASIC for a week. And then my parents said, what, this is your dad and your brother's computer. You need to go outside and play. And I didn't program again until my 30s because, hey, that wasn't for me, and that's what I was told as a little kid, and that was just enforced. So, yeah.
Questions? Any other questions? Yep, 1 second. Let me get to it. I've read them. Ooh.
So following on from that, then, what do you think that those of us who are recruiting should do to attract more women to the profession?
I think you should go to ncwit.org. They have a resource section, which is great. That's the National Council for Women in IT. I'm on the board for one of their chairs there. I think they have a lot of really good resources on recruiting, on taking bias out of your recruiting language. I know that some places now are doing a double blind interview, much like, I'm sure you've heard about these interviews that the symphony gave when they realized they were hiring more men to play. They actually put a screen up so you couldn't see who was playing and could just hear the music, and then suddenly more women were playing. It wasn't that they were terrible musicians, it's that there was a bias from the interviewer, and not necessarily something that, of course, they would recognize in themselves. It was a subconscious bias, so we have those. But NCWIT actually has incredible resources on hiring, and I would go there before, I would spout a bunch of stuff from stage.
One question, you were talking about, in the early days, women were computer programmers, but one thing that put me to mind was, since early stuff was happening at Harvard, an even earlier generation of people, of the women who were running the Harvard College observatories as human computers in
right.
teens and 20s, and produced many of the early advance of what laid the groundwork for the modern science of astrophysics, with people like Henrietta Swan-Leavitt, Cecilia Payne-Kopachkin, and Andy Jumpcannon, and a bunch of others whose names I'm not remembering.
Right. Actually, I have like a 6-volume set of encyclopedias about women in the sciences. So a lot of everything we know about astronomy, the groundwork for a lot of physics after calculus was women. And then you have Hypatia, who was one of the very first mathematicians. Women are everywhere. We just kind of write them out of history. And Grace kind of got written out of history when the computer boys came and took over. And, everyone got excited about personal computers. We forgot about all of this. We kind of forgot about who laid that groundwork. It was not as exciting. So it's nice to be able to kind of bring that back and bring back the fact that Grace Hopper did something. She did something big. She changed what we all do. I mean, she believed that computers could do more than math. I mean, that's why we're all here. She made a compiler. It's pretty badass. Anything else?
So I have a question. What, in your travels and interviews, what's something that's really surprised you? Something that you go into something with a mindset and expectation. What took you by surprise in your conversations with people?
What surprised me most about my conversations with people who knew and loved Grace was how much they protected her privacy. This is something that we wouldn't really find in this day and age. I mean, the things they protected were so interesting. That Grace was a smoker. They did not want to talk about the fact that she smoked like several packs of cigarettes a day. They did not want to talk about the fact that when she was in the hospital, she would sneak cigarette packs. She would hide them behind the toilets and under shit and, between her mattresses and in her pillowcases and on windowsills. And she would smoke in her hospital rooms. They didn't want to talk about this kind of stuff. They didn't want to talk about who she was as a person. Something that maybe surprised me a lot was how much emotion was still there for people who worked with her, how much they revered her and at the same time hated her. This was apparent in my talk with Howard Bromberg, who was, of course, really upset that she was, writing these COBOL programs and giving them away for free. Because information wants to be free and everyone should learn this. And Grace had made it so easy for anyone to learn it. But how much anger he still had that she did that. She ruined his business idea or whatever. So that was interesting. But maybe the most interesting thing is that all of those people knew that Grace was a pivot point. And this is obvious in the way that we talked about her, that she was really the pivot point on where programming is gone. But no one who I talked to that is a historian or any of that, they didn't really believe that. They don't believe that she was the pivot point, that she really is the axis that all of this turned on. It's a shame.
Any other questions? Okay, one more. This will be the last one.
I'm a bit confused about Grace giving away COBOL. You said she was not involved with the team developing COBOL, but rather did Flowmatic before that eventually led to COBOL. So she got hold of a COBOL implementation and then gave it away for free, or she did implement it, or what?
Okay, so the timeline of Flowmatic, she developed Flowmatic with her team at Remington Rand. COBOL was based on Flowmatic. That was written by committee. This committee was made up of several people from several different companies and universities. They all came together to make it. Later on, because they'd made it, and it was Grace's idea, she's like, we need to invent this so that, executives aren't afraid to touch a computer. Later on, of course, Grace was a big advocate for COBOL, which she needed to be because that sold computers, which was her job when she wasn't in the Navy. So she became a giant advocate for COBOL. And later, in her third stint in the Navy, when she was validating compilers, like, how do you even do that? Like, from the machine code to the... Anyway, she was validating compilers. She also was writing the standards for how to use COBOL in the military. So she was very involved in COBOL, she just didn't write it. And a lot of people assume that she wrote it, which is erroneous. What did she give away? She gave away programs. I mean, at some point, while she was in the Navy, the second time, because it was the 60s. So while she was in the Navy, she would have the people that worked with her write programs specific to the machines that people were using. And if they asked for it, she would write the program and then use it on her machines, which was pretty cool. But that's what she did. I just remembered I interviewed someone who wrote the first COBOL program for microcomputers. Everyone said it couldn't be done. It was just this woman living in Bend, Oregon, really super chill and unassuming. And she also wrote the program that detects all the space junk. She's like, yeah, I did that, no big deal. I was like, what the fuck? That's awesome. Anyway, it's been great.
Ladies and gentlemen, Melissa Pierce.
Super lucky.